Welcome to today's webinar. We are talking about scaling security operations today, and specifically when a GSOC adds value. Joining me today, we have Solace Global and Global Guardian joining forces together, and we'll start with some introductions. I've got Robert Aldous from Solace Global, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Robert Aldous. I'm the Chief Customer Officer for Solace Global Risk.
Thank you. And Spencer Tadkin from Global Guardian.
I'm Spencer Tadkin. I'm the Executive Vice President of Operations for Global Guardian. And thanks for the time.
My name is Amy Stone. I'm Head of Marketing at Solace Global Risk. Let's start with what we'll be talking about today. So today we're going to explore how enterprises are considering their security operations capability. We'll look at what challenges are driving that conversation and some of the practical considerations when building a business case for change. So today isn't going to be a technical deep dive into GSOCs or a comparison of the different products and platforms, but we will be sharing insights from organisations at different stages of their journey, whether they're just at the beginning of assessing what they need, through to those that are implementing more mature security capabilities. So let's start by looking at why more people are reassessing their security operations capability and the factors that are driving those conversations. Rob, let's talk about why now and what are the changes that you're seeing in the current security landscape?
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, it's a big question to start the webinar, but it's an important one. And I think that sort of zooming out, it's appropriate to look at that everyone's journey is going to be different in this space, depending on where you work, what sector you work in, appetite for security transformation or projects in some way. And a lot of people's journeys are cyclic in this space as well. So we've worked with a lot of people where their journey over 5-10 years goes from having a GSOC to outsourcing a GSOC to nothing to outsourcing and then bringing back in-house again. So very, very dependent on the company culture, attitude, budgets, etc. And all of these parts will have some type of handle on their own requirement of what they want to achieve out of whether it's a GSOC insourced or outsourced, or whether it's some type of other conduit for information security base. So we are seeing, obviously, in the market, the world is a hot place right now. Geopolitics has never been more front and center. I think that there's some transformation in that space, as well as the travel risk space over the last 5-10 years, which has really brought those departments as well to the fore and given the technology to support that messaging internally. And I think we're at a really good time, sort of opportunistically wise, those departments, especially security departments, to show their worth across functions, across departments, which I know we're going to go on to in this presentation a little bit. So all of these people on this diagram will have a vested interest. And for whatever reason, in an organization, they'll have different weightings of that interest about what they want to achieve out of a GSOC. And today, I think we'll focus on a number of elements around trying to prepare that messaging, but obviously really concentrating on the outputs and the value add to the wider organization. And I think that just looking by who we've got on the call today, a real array of people from all different types of departments. Obviously, the common thread is security, but I think that I'll put forward the argument today that actually, although security operations may be the driver around any type of security transformation, I think a lot of people can get value out of that, what we call the GSOC.
And we've covered, the different reasons of why people will start assessing their capabilities. When we start looking at when they start that process, for you, when you're assessing things, where do you usually start?
We've got a sort of a step process that we've put in place to help our client last year. And there's no one story that fits all, but what we've tried to do is put some key guardrails in. So you could start from phase 1 here all the way up to phase 7, just to give you the takeaway to understand if they are starting this journey from scratch, then the primary recommendation is to really understand your baseline risk profile, understand the problem set that you're working with, the why part of the journey. And I think although we've got it at step 5 here, the importance of getting all different stakeholders engaged right from the start, and that gives a number of positives, whether that's budgetary or communications messaging across the organization, but really allows the driver, be that security in this case, to corral, support, market their own function and department positively internally as well. So I think that just going through, picking out a couple of other the key points in this process is that, yes, understanding what you're creating something for, that output might be a GSOC in the end. Understanding that there's going to be other people involved in that concept of operations. A GSOC, by any definition, is made up of some constituent parts which are relatively simple in practice, but the output can be very nuanced as well. And we've been personally been a part of a building GSOCs from a one person in a TV through to a full floor of data centers, etc., providing value to the wider organization. The systems architecture piece, products, etc., can be brought in at any time, but making sure that you've got that architecture in place with the right stakeholders is key as people go along that journey.
And actually, when we were talking about this earlier, we were talking about how it's a communications project, really, and when that stakeholder engagement comes in, that's really what makes or breaks a successful project or not.
Absolutely, and just to re-emphasize that point, when we were discussing this earlier in preparation for today's session, that the importance of highlighting the fact that although technology is involved, although security might be the driver, it's actually a communications exercise across the organization of how successful this transformation project could be. Thank you for bringing that up.
We've looked at why organizations are reassessing their capability, but the reality is that security as a role has drastically evolved over the last few years, and what's expected from security operations today is actually very different to even 5 or 10 years ago. So, Spencer, what are people asking for today that perhaps they weren't asking for previously?
Interesting enough, I think people are asking for conversations like this. I think they're looking for an outside perspective, someone to come in with a different assessment, someone to look at an organization and figure out what's the best fit. The common ask, first and foremost, is value. How can a GSOC bring the value to the firm? And it's more than probably what it was 5 to 10 years ago of like it being a monitoring center. Now they're asking GSOCs to be a force multiplier to an organization, allowing it and forcing it to be an early warning detection system, proactive and reactionary, really to inform decision-making across the enterprise level. And that value is so important. I think that's where the discussion or the main ask is coming. It wasn't there 10 years ago. And I use that force multiplier description a lot because I think that's the most common ask right now. Secondly, it's people. It's the brand, it's the corporation, the GSOC representation of that. 10 years or last 10 years, a lot's happened domestically, internationally, politically. COVID changed the workforce for better or for worse, however you want to look at it. And GSOCs and organizations now have to track, have more visibility and more awareness of remote workers. And the GSOCs are being asked to be a part of that because it's not just facilities anymore, headquarters. It's if a natural disaster comes in, how will it impact my employees, not just their personal travel, their work travel, but their remote locations too. So the GSOCs are being asked to see more. That naturally leads into the executive expectations. You want the GSOCs to be a part of an enterprise. Executives want the GSOC to give information to drive decision-making, to paint the operational picture, to be able to explain to the organization what's happening on the ground, explain the incident, what triggers are in place, how will this natural disaster affect supply chain, protect profit and people or revenue and people, really drive awareness. I think GSOCs are so important now as they weren't maybe 10 years ago as far as the information provided to executives. And then lastly, the coordinated response. There is a sense of GSOCs looking like nothing has changed over 24/7, regardless of where the companies operate in the world. When a call comes in, it's responded to as fast as possible. It doesn't feel like there's ever a flux in capability, that they're looking for quickness, a true 24/7 response. When we talk about coordinated response, it's the GSOCs able to take information and then be these like switchboard operators within an organization to take the information and then apply it to various positions within a task org. Be able to make sure that the response comes from one voice, one intake, but the information is pushed out as well as it's taken in. So there's been a lot of great kind of natural evolution of GSOCs, but truly the takeaway here is providing overall value to an organization from just an intake facility, but to an intake, proactive, and reactionary model, and really be a decision making or provide information for decision making for an enterprise.
That captures the vast range of expectations that are being asked of security teams nowadays. So that takes us on nicely to some of the common obstacles that enterprises are facing. Now, there is so much more expectation amongst them. So, Spencer, what's the biggest misconception that organizations tend to have when they might start exploring a GSOC?
If the question was asked, what is a GSOC to 10 different people, I bet you'll get 10 different answers. Because I think it really comes down to the discovery and how the company is going to use a GSOC. Is it camera management? Is it intelligence? Is it operations? Is it travel tracking? Is it access control? A variety of. It's not just a tech solution. A lot of what the misconception can be is, well, let me just grab this one piece of technology and then we're good and we don't need headcount and we'll be able to provide the services we need to our organization because we have X technology. It's more than that. It's be able to digest the information that's coming through the technology and then output it into the organization. To be able to articulate the results coming in and then putting it into the organization correctly. The second point, probably the biggest misconception, is location. And it's probably the hardest discussion point and the most dynamic. And there are pros and cons to both models. It's what's important to the organization. Capability, I think, matters more than just location. If your GSOC, for example, is a intelligence-focused global operations center, DC naturally has a massive capability because it's surrounded by universities that focus on intelligence. It has retired or 5 or 10-year experience DIA, CIA, FBI, and that's a whole different mental capability that they can bring to bear into a GSOC. It's a hard discussion because you're taking something and you're kind of outsourcing it and you may not be able to touch it. And maybe that's okay because maybe at the end of the day, no one actually visits the GSOC. It's not really part of the day-to-day meetings. But then there's the other side of location. Does location matter because it's important to the organization as a showpiece or the brand, where if someone's on their first day of the company and they walk past the operations center and they see these maps and news and all of these things, and it provides a sense of comfort that me as an employee, my company is looking out for me. There's an element of that. But it comes down to is where is that location and are you going to get the best value for where you are? And it's a great discussion and there's no perfect answer, but it really comes down to being okay to have the discussion on let's identify the criticality of your operations, your GSOC. What is it you want to drive towards? And then that will dictate where it is. And I think that's just probably the most dynamic discussion right now. And then the third point here, I can only have an operations center or a GSOC if I'm a large organization and we're worth $100 billion. I think they can come in all sizes. At the end of the day, it's to be able to take weight off of an organization. A GSOC can, as Rob mentioned earlier, can be one person. It can be hyper-focused on that one person is going to be tracking all the travelers for that organization because that organization is now traveling more, taking to riskier locations. And that individual, that GSOC analyst or operator can track that, ensure that the technology is pushing out alerts, take the pressure off any chief security officer or executive because someone is solely focused on that from 9 to 5 because it's domestic travel in the United States only, or it's 2 to 10 because it's Asia focused, whatever it is. It's so versatile, and that's the best part. And it's not one size fits all, but it's all in the discovery. And it is a balance of cost. And then lastly, it's not just a security function. Like I said before, GSOCs are force multipliers to an organization. They're so much more a part of an organization than it's ever been. Just recently on a tabletop on how the GSOCs roles is to identify when a medical event occurs for them to identify the symptoms and then provide that to the firm, sending it to the chief medical officer. And they're the first step of that. Or helping with an investigation and that going to the investigation team. And then that's going to work with HR. So they've become so much bigger and they're so much part of an organization now where it's not just security. Security may oversee it naturally, but it's touching a lot more than it ever did. And that's kind of where the value comes to play. And that's kind of where you want the GSOCs to go for impact to the firm.
Thanks, Spencer. And I think that just gives so much detail on just how nuanced it actually is when you're having that conversation about building a GSOC. Like you say, it's not one size fits all. So moving on to actually assessing what you actually need. So like we said, where there's nuance for every organisation. Rob, how should our audience even begin to understand their own requirements?
The sort of step one and the ability to engage stakeholders from different departments to understand where you be a force multiplier and add value to the rest of the organization gives you a number of positive points. A, it ensures that you communicate your need from a security perspective, because slightly contrary to previous comments, the ops room could be just cameras and monitoring and be a GSOC in that function. I think at the time now, we've got so much opportunity, whether it's data, technology or other, to be able to add value to other stakeholders. So why not build that in? So I think building that picture of the why, building that picture of other stakeholders' needs is a really good opportunity that shouldn't be missed. And that will, I think, really naturally and organically bring the requirement together. As you progress in that phase, I think that right now, everyone will have their security providers or their travel risk providers or other. And the importance to get external validation, I think, is something that really should be contemplated. The opportunity to get benchmarking across your industry as well all adds argument and all adds fuel into that positioning, especially if you're trying to pitch for budget internally to say, this is what the industry is doing, this is what our travel security partner or our security partner is saying as well, and this is the solution that's best fit culturally and operationally for the organization. So I think that hopefully that answers your question about bringing all those points together.
Thanks, Rob. When we're talking about bringing the right people in and having the right conversations, asking the right questions, as you can see here, you've got 3 options available, whether you build it yourself, outsource it, or find a mixture of the two. Rob, tell us a little bit about what that looks like in your experience when you've been dealing with these types of projects.
There's pros and cons to any of these approaches to get the solution that people need. Now, I think that we discussed earlier today, Amy and Spencer, and I'd like to bring it in here that Spencer, you made a really great comment, I thought, around being creative, allowing the GSOC teams to be creative with their output, etc. And that's something that, depending on the culture of the organization, is much easier to do if it's yours. You can empower people to have that sort of creative vision around what they want to achieve, less so if you outsource it, because people will want to deliver against a certain amount of SOPs and SLAs, etc. So the creativity, I would argue, would maybe dissipate the less control you have on it. I think that if an organization wants to outsource their GSOC, some of the benefits are actually you get immediate capability, immediate uplift, as you've shown in this graph. Could be very expensive initially, but allows you to outsource to professionals as well. And there is a degree of separation which could be politically approved more than having your own internal GSOC. Now, the internal GSOC build is going to take longer, absolutely. It could be completely new to a security organization and could be new to the organization's culture. That build will be slower. The capability, I would argue, would always be better within house with some guidance, external guidance or other, because people will live and breathe the culture of that organization. That sort of brings me on to something that we're seeing more commonly now is this hybrid approach. So ensuring that you have that relevant expertise externally to your organization, informing you, whether that's through data or having someone physically positioned in your provider's GSOC with your, for want of a better word, your polo shirt with your logo on it, so people know who you are. But then at least they understand the culture of your organization. They get the benefits of that outsourced provider, and it's a little bit closer to you from an operational delivery perspective. The best route very much depends on the culture of the organization, and there's some key factors around budget, appetite, etc. that need to be considered.
That breaks it down really clearly. Thank you. So zooming out a little bit and looking at the importance of aligning the capability with your security requirements, but the reality is most organizations don't wake up one day and decide they need to review their security operations model. So let's look at some of the typical events and the typical scenarios that we're seeing that's triggering these conversations or prompt that conversation. So Spencer, let's start with rapid growth.
It's at a point where the complexity, speed, and risk exposure to a firm increases faster than the GSOC's ability to maintain its core function. And I say that because it needs to have the visibility of the travelers. It needs to ensure that it has its core function always. And if the complexities and lack of visibility goes away, then that's kind of where that reevaluation needs to happen. The GSOC has to maintain the discipline. It has to be able to analyze the situation utilizing a threat matrix and then take the appropriate reactions. It's a representation of the brand. So at any point that goes away because of the rapid growth, then you're kind of in a hard sticking point here. Really understanding the enterprise and then understanding the enterprise's growth and letting ensure that the GSOC staff knows the growth methodology of the firm, then it ensures it can staff appropriately. But kind of rolls into the second point here, and our general counsel uses this discussion point a lot, where he talks about the Spider-Man meme, where an event occurs, and what you don't want is when the Spider-Man's pointing to two other Spider-Mans and saying, well, I thought you were doing it, or I thought you were doing it. And that's the incident. That's what you want to stay away from when you talk about complexity and fear here. When an incident occurs, who owns it? Whose ownership is there? And at any point you feel that the GSOC doesn't have the resources necessary because we're at the Spider-Man meme, then that's where you kind of have a problem. It needs to have the ownership. Then you have to review the technology and the technology concerns. And then you have to reevaluate the personnel concerns. And do you have the right personnel management to staff it to ensure that you're not behind the times? And it's a management of the talent as well, which goes into retention. All of that showcasing for a change before it's too late. And it's a hard thing to manage. So it goes to say that taking that one step back is if you can involve the GSOC leadership into the growth discussions in some way to a firm, it'll really minimize the rapid growth and being behind the power curve, or an incident occurs and you don't have the appropriate tools in place. And you just got to make sure that it's very much in lines with the new travel guidance, the new travel plans, personal versus business. Where's the organization going to go that it didn't go last year? So nothing surprises the GSOC.
So Rob, when we start looking at the demand from leadership, what are you seeing there?
Yes, there is a demand on leadership, which is almost silent from a security perspective. I think there's obviously going to be the natural requests of keep people, operations, reputation safe, etc. But actually, I think it's more of an opportunity in this space that we hear phrases such as business resilience, operational resilience, business continuity. I'm from making me feel very old now of the plans that when a business continuity was about getting people on a bus and shipping to another office location, and sort of COVID put that out the window. And I think that there's an opportunity now with be it technology or be it AI or other security leadership, have an opportunity to really add greater value to wider the organization rather than it being demanded, of making sure that this GSOC or this concept of operation adds value to the wider organization. And I think that as the request to leadership matures and grows, that opportunity grows as well, and that culture builds around security, and then hopefully it's just inherent to the organization as it moves forward. So I sort of reframe that demand now with second eyes and go, okay, well, yes, there's a demand for me as a leadership director within security to deliver on the security elements, but how can I add value to others, such as, and off the top of my head of what we've done previously, is climate change, ESG risk, etc., physical risk to customers, for example, not just people. When I was building a GSOC back in 2013 for an oil and gas major, we were always trying to ask questions: what can we do with this data? What can we do with historical data? GSOCs are a fantastic resource for corporate history as well, because it tends to last the test of time beyond security managers as they move on. So how can we use the trend of our data as an organization to forecast about new country entry or forecasting customer patterns, etc.? So I get quite excited about the creative elements of what a GSOC could provide. Admittedly, there are obviously the nuts and bolts of GSOC operations as well. So I think reframing it as leadership opportunity rather than just demand on them is probably the way to go.
Thank you, Rob. So we've looked at the scenarios about what triggers someone to look at their security operations capability. We've also looked at the opportunities and the value add from it. So when we've got all of that together, how can we turn that into a meaningful conversation, and how can we present that internally? So Rob, how do you take that to the leadership or the board team?
Just to zoom out and look at what we've covered so far, we've covered sort of that stakeholder engagement. We've sort of understood understanding the why and maybe the what and how we want to take things forward. And I think this one really has to be led by the point of contact in the business around culture of that organization. So no one wants to be surprised at the board presentations around someone bringing a new transformation project that's going to cost X millions of pounds over the next few years. So I think that's a lesson learned from my early career. But I think that going over the last 10 years, people are aware that we are in an ever increasing and more risky operating environment more generally around wherever you go in the world nowadays. I think if you can frame and pitch a GSOC of some description, you don't even have to call it a GSOC, by the way, but if it has that capability and it adds value to these other organizations and this is the output, I think that the outputs are where people should really focus on. All security briefs, as people will be aware on this call, tend to look at obviously the why, impacts, others, security of people, etc., all get seen as a cost overhead by the rest of the business or something that they have to spend on rather than anything revenue generating or supporting revenue and income. So I think the more that you can frame that offering, and it'll be different for different companies and culturally sensitive in some areas, but I think that the more you can frame it as a business enabler, adding value to the organization and giving clear examples of outputs, I think that's when board members get excited around transformation, efficiency, and driving the company forward into the next phase.
And Spencer, is there anything that you've seen that works particularly well when people are taking that conversation to the board?
There's definitely reoccurring themes here. I think culture is so important, either insourced or outsourced. To speak to outsource, it's what is that company aligned with your company's culture? Are they going to act the way you want them to act? Are they going to respond in a manner that aligns with what you're going for and that trust? And I think that resonates a lot, but it goes back to the discovery and how important that is to ensure that when you go to present this and that when you are making the case for it, that you're ensuring that it impacts the firm as a whole. It's a decision maker that brings value, and value was what we talked about early on and how important that is to the leadership discussion, because cost is cost, headcount is headcount. But when you can figure out, when you can offset it with, here's all the functions I'm going to associate with, here's how I'm going to take some pressure off the enterprise, here's how I'm going to be a proactive response unit, that goes to enabling the business to be more successful and a level of confidence to the company as a whole that there's this overseeing eye to support, or overseeing entity of support. And overall, it's just the support to the people, that when you present this is how does this help the firm as a whole in a level of safety and security.
And thank you, Spencer. So I think we've covered off that there is a huge amount of nuance, a huge amount of variety in the different challenges that people are facing, and people are still asking the same underlying questions. What capability do we need? How do we justify it, and how do we align it with the wider business priorities and culture? Before we wrap up, let's go to both of our panelists for one final piece of guidance. So Spencer, if there was one piece of advice you could give to an organization if they were right at the beginning of their journey, what would it be?
I would say discovery and get all your information. Take the time to understand your organization as a whole. What critical entities or what critical problems do you need to address? Where are the pain points? And I say discovery a lot, because if you can understand what's going to relieve some pressure of the organization, how is this GSOC going to help the organization, to really understand that and then be able to create the products and then reach out to entities that can help guide you and give you that assessment if this is the first time ever building a GSOC. There's no reason to rush to failure here. Doing your due diligence on the technology and then balancing technology and the human entity and getting that all right based on your company's travel plans, your company's facilities, and where they are. So it just goes back to taking the time to do the discovery well between an internal look and getting all the critical stakeholders involved and getting their understanding of where they need relief and pressure and help. It's the best starting point to do it right, because you want to provide that value long term.
And Rob, what would your advice be to someone that's building on existing capabilities, or someone in a more mature security position?
It's easier actually when people come in fresh into an organization and they have good ideas and they can be listened to as a new joiner into a mature organization. I think the real difficulty, if I was going to put the more difficult situation, is if you've been at an organization for some time and then you try and change things either from a transformative perspective or another idea of some description to help the business move forward. So I think getting that pitch, if we say mature is an organization that's pretty set in doing its ways, let's take that as an assumption. Getting that one-page pitch, almost treat it as a startup. I would argue that in an organization that you need to get your one-page pitch right by consulting different stakeholders and others, ensuring that the ultimate value, if it's not going to have a overall net positive from a cost perspective, then you need some good explanations of why and what added value you're going to have wider to the organization. So in essence, yeah, treat it like almost a Dragon's Den style one-page pitch startup that says, this is what I need to condense this offering down to. This is I need to be able to show immediate value here with what I'm trying to suggest, and then use your partners. Use your partners to get that communications right, not necessarily just security partners, but others that can translate that information into something that's coherent for to align with the culture of your organization.
Thanks, Rob. If you were to look ahead and had a crystal ball in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, where do you see things going for the development of GSOCs, and how do you see that coming into play?
I think the evolution of AI, it is the hot topic. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's going to be a part of GSOCs in some way. It's going to be part of the technology in some way. And I think that's going to always help awareness and always help the response element to a firm. But I think that's going to be really unique in the GSOC space.
I agree. I think the AI space is really interesting, especially from a sort of an ML predictive analysis perspective. But I'd like to think that there's always going to be value with a human voice. And I think there's always going to be value with understanding the chaos theory that things are going to be in place that only a human could see across all of those areas. And I think you're right, Spencer. I think that as that technology increases, I think actually it puts the human at an elevated position potentially to look more wider operationally as well across and look at themes, trends, etc., and really ask those questions around what can we deliver now above and beyond what we're already delivering.
What are 2 absolute requirements you would recommend for a one-person virtual GSOC?
It's a very personal thing for organizations, but sort of the absolute requirements, especially for a one-person virtual GSOC, is having a platform that you really trust and can be really easily used by others and understood. You need to, as a one person attempting to do a GSOC for, I'm guessing, for a medium-sized organization, there's going to be a lot of pressure on you to deliver the basic requirements, and having a platform that you trust and is potentially one of best in the industry or other, but really fits your company. I think that's really, really important. And I think the other one from my perspective is I was doing that, and I've done that for a period of months in an oil and gas company, is setting expectation with the rest of the company about what they expect as an output from that. So being very clear that you can deliver this with the funds or with the capability that you have. You might want to then make the argument just one person running a GSOC remotely, a big task. Setting that expectation and making sure that you have got steps to progression and people understand the uplifting requirement versus cost, etc. And also having redundancy for that one person in some way, shape or form. I think that you're obviously a critical person to that organization. So what happens from a resilience perspective?
I would say the backup plan is always a huge discussion point. And it's really understanding, and I agree with everything you're saying, Rob, because it's understanding that person's role. What their left and right limit can only be so big, because if anytime you add more, it starts diluting what the actual role or what the criticality of that role would be. So really ensuring that the enterprise or the organization or that person knows what they're outputting. And then when that person takes off, how critical is that role? Will you have to have someone to replace it? And will that person be up to date with the technology? And that's kind of maybe a forgotten thing, like in the United States, you have 120 hours of PTO that you've got to backfill. That's 3 weeks. Ensuring that that's taken care of is really important.
Spencer. And actually that takes us on nicely to one of the topics that we cover in the white paper that Rob mentioned earlier in the session. It goes into great length looking at, just as a starting point to help you understand, where you are, what you need, and looking at your travel capabilities and things that will be needed for that redundancy. So if you want to download it, the QR code is on your screen there. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. Hope the session was really useful. Thanks, Spencer. Thanks, Rob.